Good evening. It's interactive today. Thank you for coming to the Baker Institute this evening. My name is Kirsten Matthews. I am the Baker Institute Fellow in Science and Technology Policy. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program. This evening event, as well as the research that was the basis of this program, was a joint effort between the Baker Institute's Science and Technology Policy Program, the Transnational China Program, and Rice University's Religion and Public Life Program. The book we're discussing today, Secularity and Science, What Scientists Around the World Really Think About Religion, was a result of this collaborative work led by our keynote speaker, Dr. Elaine Howard Ecklund. In addition to Dr. Ecklund and myself, there are 5 other co-authors involved in this project, including 2 who should be present this evening. I'm going to see if I can find them. Dr. Stephen Lewis is here in the back waving, and Dr. David Johnson. It's over to the side. Thank you so much for coming. Dr. Lewis is the Baker Institute CV Star Transnational China Fellow. So obviously he's our expert in China. And Dr. David Johnson's assistant professor in sociology at University of Nevada, Reno. And thank you both for coming. As you will hear in later talks, this research project was an impressive feat led by Dr. Ecklund and extraordinary in scope. It consisted of an international survey with more than 20,000 biologists and physicists in 8 countries and regions around the world. This includes the United States, the United Kingdom, Italy, France, India, Turkey, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. During the course of the project, researchers conducted more than 500 in-depth interviews of these scientists. The survey and interviews covered various areas of social factors that impacted scientists' works, but predominantly the questions were the focus of if and how religion impacted science or the scientists' lives, the subject of the book we're talking about today. As a researcher working on the intersection of science and public policy, I find this book's finding intriguing, and I hope you will do so as well. The structure of the night's events will include a presentation by Dr. Ecklund discussing highlights from the book, with remarks from Dr. John Evans. After the presentation, Dr. Ecklund and Dr. Evans will participate in a moderated question and answer session with the audience, followed with a discussion, and after this discussion, a light reception will be served, as well as the book could be signed if you purchased it. To moderate our session this morning, we have in the Q&A Dr. John Evans. Dr. Evans is the Tata Chancellor's Chair in Social Sciences and Professor of Sociology at the University of California, San Diego. He has written extensively on the areas of science and religion, with particular interest in genetics and genomic issues, making him the ideal person to moderate tonight's discussion with Dr. Ecklund. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Evans.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for having me here. I just want to briefly start with a few sort of meta-contextual comments. I have a sense of what Elaine is going to present to you, so I don't want to replicate that. I want to talk at a somewhat higher level, which she probably won't be speaking at. First, I'll talk about, very briefly, this is an act of sociology she's engaged in. And what is sociology? That's a very good question. In this instance, though, it's dedicated to making sure we all understand each other. If you think about a liberal democratic society, and I'm here in the Baker Institute, the point is we can disagree. I should be able to show up and say, I think this, and you think that, and I'm going to try to convince you of my views, you try to convince me of your views, and let's discuss, and that's how democracies work. One of the problems is we don't discuss, we don't meet these other people, et cetera, so we base our views upon assumptions. I assume that because you're like this, you must think that, et cetera, et cetera. Well, a lot of sociology is at its best when it tries to debunk assumptions or clarify for people what people actually think. So, for example, there's a lot of discussion about religion and science, and part of the problem is that people assume, since you're a scientist, you must think X. I was watching a focus group of religious people who said, well, and they had these interviews with these scientists, they said, well, you're a scientist, you obviously don't believe in the forwarding of values. And then the other way around, people say, well, you're a religious person, obviously you don't believe in anything about science. So just clarifying what people's views actually are, I think, is a healthy contribution to democracy, and that's the most meta-level contribution of a work like this. But to go at another level of abstraction here, I think of this book as the culmination of a research tradition that began in 1916, where there was a very early form of social science where this person went and did a survey of people who were members of the National Academy of Sciences. Okay. And the question was, to what extent are members of the National Academy of Sciences religious versus the public? And this has been used over the years to basically test the secularization thesis. The assumption was that religion and science are conflicting ways of knowing the world. Religion is only about knowing the world and how the world operates, and that therefore those who know the most science, represented by members of the National Academy of Sciences, couldn't possibly be religious because these two views conflict. And that has been shown to be, very inaccurate over the years. But Elaine's book takes this to, I think, to the ultimate level, taking advantage of modern science. So of all the institutions on the planet we could think of across countries, science has an incredible degree of uniformity because of all of the structures that make it so. So if you are a physicist in China and you're a physicist in the United States, et cetera, not perfectly, but to a very large extent, you're under the same norms, you try to publish in the same journals, you're contributing to the same debate. And by taking advantage of this, we can essentially control for science and compare the incredible religious and cultural diversity across these various places. So, for example, as we'll hear in a minute, we have the US religious context. We have the largely secular United Kingdom, but with Anglican remnants and a Muslim migration population, the aggressively secular France, the cultural Catholics of Italy, the moderate Muslims of Turkey, and so on and so forth. So by looking at all the different ways that religion and science interact across these different cultural contexts, we can understand this far better than that study in 1916, another in 1934, and by the 1950s this had become a bit of a cottage industry. So I want to add something that is mentioned by Kristen a minute ago, but is easily glossed over, and I'll put on my sociology hat for a minute, which is I was on the original advisory board, or whatever it was called, for this study, and Elaine brought us here to Rice and said, so I've got this plan. I want to do this study across X number of countries. I want to do all this stuff, and I just sort of stopped in my seat and said, well, you know that there's no population of scientists to sample from in France. There's no, list. So where are you going to get a list? And she goes, well, I also want to do Turkey. I said, do you know that there's no list of scientists in Turkey? And we kept going on and on with this. I said, well, how do you intend to do this? Okay. And then all of a sudden I realized, well, I'm going to do in-depth interviews. And I said, you know that not all these people speak English at the level that you required, so someone's going to have to go interview them in French. Yes. Okay. So the punchline is to create, I know this is going to be glossed over here, and we don't want to get into the weeds of sociological methodology and so forth, but there's a sort of a heroic level of data gathering here to make sure that these aren't just based upon a group of people I talk to, but I think you can safely assume that the sample that she's talking about is truly representative of the population that she's talking about, including things like how would you generate a sample of scientists in France? You would look at all the publications from France in a field and look at who authored them and winnow that down in very systematic ways. How would you do that in Chinese? You would hire a bunch of Chinese-speaking undergraduates, who can do this, And so, it just never ceases to amaze me. And then how would you go interview these people? Well, you'd find someone who speaks Turkish, okay? And so this is something far beyond I've ever tried, far beyond anything I would ever try, okay? And so I just want to, because I know she's not going to toot her horn like that, so I just wanted to toot the horn for her that whenever you see a study like this, you want to make sure that what you're seeing is an accurate representation of reality. I think you can be the most certain of any study in this field that I'm aware of. So with that, I will step aside and let Elaine take over, and I'll be back at the end to lead the discussion.
Thank you for being here tonight. I am a sociologist, and one thing that's maybe a little bit distinctive about what I do as a sociologist when compared to, say, my husband, who's a physicist, a natural scientist, is that the subjects of my study speak to me, right? So our natural science colleagues, if their research subjects, their particles or their molecules started speaking to them, we would think certain things about those scientists. And I can remember exactly where I was when I first thought, oh, I ought to study what scientists think about religion. It was actually, I'm ashamed to say how many years ago, it was 20 years ago now, when I first started my PhD program at Cornell University, and I was working with my major advisor on a project on religion and family. And as part of that project, one of my research tasks was to go to Bible studies in churches. And I was in a Bible study one evening, and a woman casually asked me, so what do you do for your work? And I said, well, I'm a PhD student at Cornell University. And she said, yuck! I thought, that's kind of an unusual response. I quickly went down the road of maybe she wanted her kids to attend Harvard. I mean, I just sort of wasn't sure why she would say yuck when I said Cornell University, so I queried a little further. And I said, well, why such a strong reaction? He said, well, I wouldn't want my kids to go to Cornell University because they might meet scientists there who would take them away from their faith. And I thought, I had to study this. Are scientists, really out to eat young Christian children for lunch? So I kind of started something of a research trajectory, one piece of it being studying what scientists think about religion. Then another incident where my research subject spoke to me. I was well into a US-based study and realized that in the US, at our top research universities, about 20 to 40% of scientists are from a nation outside the US. And I was talking to one such scientist, and I asked him, as I often do, so what do you think? Is there a conflict between science and religion? And those of you who are scientists know scientists can be very empowered when it comes to accuracy and knowledge. Other kinds of studies, the research respondents just let me ask my questions and they answer them. I'm the one who has the power in the situation. In this particular incident, the research scientist said to me, that's a dumb question. Is there a conflict between religion and science? Another kind of light goes off. He says, I said, why do you think it's a dumb question? He says, well, because I'm a Hindu, and in my particular context in India, we never would think in those kind of binaries. Is there a conflict between science and religion? He says, this is not really a meaningful question. That's not the right question to be asking. I was glad he spoke back to me because that started a trajectory trying to understand how scientists in different kind of national contexts understand religion. I started out on my own in this research project, but I quickly realized, as John alluded to, that I needed some help. We started adding more and more people to our team. In fact, in the end, we added 101 people to our team. That's how long it took to do this research. That included 3 postdoctoral fellows, full-time research staff, subcontractors who spoke the languages that we needed in the study, PhD students who worked with us, 67 undergraduate students, and of course, the various foundations that funded aspects of this study. People came and went over the 5 years that we did this study. Some heroically stayed on, and those 7 people are on this book. If I may list them, they are myself, of course, David R. Johnson, Brandon Vayadinathan, Kirsten R.W. Matthews, Stephen W. Lewis, Robert A. Thompson, Jr., and D.D. I want to convince you of 4 things. There's much more in the book, so of course, a shameless plug. We hope you will buy the book to get those things. But just in brief, I want to talk to you about how there may be more religious scientists than we may think, and what kind of implications that might have for public dialogue and conversation. I want to talk to you about atheist scientists and how they may be more varied than we might think. I also want to argue that most scientists actually do not think there is a conflict between religion and science. And I want to talk to you a bit about the ways in which religion comes up in the scientific workplace. But first, let's talk a little bit about why it's important to study the relationship between science and religion. Religion is an important entity. Around the globe, religion is enormously significant. 5.8 billion individuals say that they are religious. Many of those who don't say they are religious say they're spiritual to some extent. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development estimates, and these numbers have only grown, that in 2007 and beyond, the global science and engineering workforce was 4.2 million. Of course, the number of people working in science is many less than the number of people who see themselves religious. But, and I think our science policy experts will tell us this, any nation that it's trying to grow its economic infrastructure is trying to grow its science and technology workforce. And science is incredibly important in the cultural imagination. And whether we like it or not, it's a social reality that the science and faith interface lives large in the public imagination around the world. And we need to study the world, not just the US, to fully understand it. We have, of course, Richard Dawkins, the former University of Oxford professor for the public understanding of science, who argues in front of an audience of millions in his New York Times bestselling book, The God Delusion, that religion and science are inherently in conflict. And of course, it's not just in the UK, his native land, but in other places where we see these kinds of ideas coming up. Meanwhile, we have in the US, Francis Collins, current director of the National Institutes of Health, who's arguing in front of his own audience that science is completely compatible with religion, his particular Christian faith. These debates are found not just in the lives of individual scientists, but they also play their way out in the public sphere. We see US debates, of course, many of you are no stranger to this, about whether or not evolution should be taught alongside intelligent design in public school classrooms. We've seen US creationist literature being translated into Turkish, and science in the United Kingdom and France, we found, worry that a recent influx of Muslims may pose unique faith-based challenges to science. Views on the relationship between science and religion can influence things like whether a parent encourages a child to take science classes, whether a child pursues a science or technology occupation, how a scientist themselves interpret the morality of certain scientific technologies and their implications, who an individual votes for, and by consequence, the public financial support for scientific research. So we set out to study this, and I'm going to gloss over the methods, but if you want to have a protracted methodological discussion after, if that kind of thing excites you, I'm super happy to do that. So, like any professor would be. We studied 8 region and country contexts. So those are the United States, United Kingdom, France, Italy, Turkey, India, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, Chinese societies. We started with a really big list. So we studied all fields of biology and physics. I mentioned those 67 undergraduate students, so that was the kind of person power we needed to put together that really big list. We then selected from that list over 22,000 scientists, and then we surveyed them. And we got roughly 50% response in some national contexts and 30 to 40% in others. We know that surveys box people in, that I, as the researcher, tell you the choices that you get to choose from among on a survey. And we wanted to know how people thought about these things in their own terms. And so to that end, we followed up surveys by getting, some of you maybe not old enough to realize this, restaurants, planes, trains, and automobiles. And we went to places, and we phoned people, and we Skyped with people, and we asked people, the scientists, what they thought about religion and religious issues in their own terms. So first, I want to show you just the proportion of religious scientists in each of these national contexts. So in France, the UK, the US, and Hong Kong, between 16 and 39% of scientists see themselves as religious. So if you're looking for religious scientists, these numbers maybe are nothing to write home about. It depends on your perspective, right? But still, scientists might be much less than religious than the general population in their given regional context as well. So we also looked at the general population compared to science through public access survey data. And we found what I think are some pretty interesting things, that indeed sometimes scientists seem to be less religious than those in their national context of a given general population. This is the widest in France, where the general public is about 3 times more likely to identify as religious when compared to scientists. A nation, of course, as John mentioned, that we often think of as very secular, avidly secular, followed by the US and the UK. The gaps, though, are more moderate in some of the other nations, namely Italy and Turkey. Interestingly, when we move to Hong Kong and Taiwan, the gaps actually reverse, where importantly, a greater proportion of scientists than those in the general public see themselves as religious. Something was unexpected. So I'm sure that's piqued your interest, but you'll have to read the book for more. And now we're going to move on to point 2. I will say that this really was the thing that surprised me the most. I was trained as a sociologist of religion, and if you had asked me as a good sociologist of religion, are there many different ways of being a religious scientist, I of course would have said, of course there are many varied ways of being a religious scientist. I think if you had asked me before we started this study if there are many different ways of being an atheist scientist, I would have said, well, being an atheist is by definition not believing in God. There's one way to not believe in God, right? I love it when the research itself disproves the researcher's own stereotypes that she has, and that definitely happened to me through doing this study. I started to understand, and our team discussed this, the varied ways of being an atheist scientist, and we've become somewhat avid about even trying to communicate these findings to religious communities who have their own stereotypes about what it means to be an atheist, in particular an atheist scientist. So first, here's a few numbers. I know some of you are going, why aren't there more numbers? And some of you are saying, where are the stories? So we tried to hit a happy medium here. So these are folks who have a convinced belief that there is no God. So we see that there's huge variation among the different regional and national contexts in those who are convinced atheists. The second big descriptive point here is that there's also variation in whether or not scientists are different from those in the general public regarding whether or not they are convinced atheists. France has a huge magnitude of difference. The US and UK have a big magnitude of difference. And again, the direction is actually reverse in Hong Kong and Taiwan. When we zero in just on the US, which I think some of you are probably particularly interested in this audience, we see that there's some interface with religion among the atheist US scientists, which I found interesting. 15% of them consider themselves religiously affiliated. 15% have a religious spouse. That's not an exact overlap, even though those are exact same proportion numbers. 17% attend religious services sometimes. 9% say that they pray sometimes. 54% say in our survey that it wasn't science that made them less religious. And 40% think that there are basic truths in many religions. I think the qualitative data are in-depth interviews where we sat with people sometimes for hours at a time. Interesting on that, some people wanted to talk a lot to us. Some people wanted to talk very little to us. Sort of, we had interviews that ranged from 20 minutes, sort of I think as a professional courtesy because we were also researchers. I remember one interview in the US where a scientist actually followed me to my car to try to keep talking about these topics as if he had waited all his life to find someone to talk to these topics about. So real range there. So there are scientists who are what we would call modernist atheists. So those who think of themselves as being very much more like a Richard Dawkins in their sensibility, think that religion and science really are in complete conflict, think that science is the very best kind of knowledge or even the only knowledge that's worth pursuing. And I want to acknowledge that certainly exists in the scientific environment. But I think it is interesting that even those modernist atheists map onto a different kind of sensibility than I would have thought. Here's a UK biologist who said that some people like Richard Dawkins, he's a fundamental atheist. He feels compelled to take the evidence way beyond that which other scientists would regard as possible. I want students to develop science in their own lives, and I think it's necessary to understand what science does address directly, and of course, by implication, what it does not. Perhaps one of the most surprising categories for me, and this was a phrase coined by one of our respondents, there are those who think of themselves as spiritual atheists. Here's an example of that. Here's a physicist who said, the spirituality part of it is why you do the work. I'm interested in understanding how the university began, possibly what its long-term future is going to be. I think those are certainly spiritual questions. And then there are those, we started calling this category church-going atheists, and some people did not like that moniker. But so we've gone to now culturally religious atheists. Again, grounded in the data, one of our respondents said, I'm just a church-going atheist. Now, oh my gosh, that's such an awesome subtitle for something, but that does not stick with reviewers. So a physicist says, I have no problem going to church services. It's like looking at another part of your culture, but I have no faith religiously. It doesn't worry me that religion is still not out there. So when you present this material, sometimes you do get pushback, and especially from religious audiences who say, that's not real religion. We don't judge. What we're doing is we are trying to describe how people see things in their own terms, and I think it's a very different image of what it means to be an atheist, that there's certainly things still that you can get from religion that are positive in society than some of the stereotypes we have about atheist scientists, which don't seem to hold. Third, most scientists do not think there's a conflict between religion and science. We have a number of different ways of assessing this relationship in the data, but I'll just present a couple of points of data. We did ask on the survey for our scientists to respond to the assertion. For me personally, my understanding of science and religion can be described as a relationship of. And you'll see that the dominant mode here across the context, certainly there is a large proportion, a large minority in each of the national contexts who think there is a conflict and that they consider themselves to be on the side of science. But the majority of our respondents think of these things as independent, that they refer to different aspects of reality. Some of you may remember the late paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould's idea of non-overlapping magisterium. That particular phrase came up a lot in the interviews. Here's what it looks like in one of the interviews. Italian physicist has said there's no conflict. Science and religion are completely distinct because there's no connection between the physical reality described by science and the existence or not of God. Again, there's no intersection in the sense that science can explain. In other words, you will never be able to prove or disprove God. God is outside the reach and limits of science. I also want to draw your attention to the minority of those in the nations, in the regional context of Hong Kong, India, Taiwan, and Turkey, who think that there is very much a collaborative relationship between science and religion. And this sometimes for us took on unexpected and intriguing forms. I want to read one interview that we did with an Indian professor of biology who said this: yes, religion, you can say that it inspires us to be disciplined, like we're having prayers which have definite timings. That means you have to get up early in the morning for the first prayer, and then after that, late in the night. So that means that there are 5 times which are fixed for the prayer. I mean, it's just one thing you can say that if you are disciplined, so that is also one of the important factors when you're doing science. If you are disciplined, that will definitely help you. I really like this interview as an example because it stresses practice. So obviously this scientist in India is a Muslim, and he is talking about the kind of disciplined regularity that's required to follow the prayers, and that kind of discipline teaches him as a practice that is also useful to his science. Often in our particular context of the US, we talk about science and religion as related to each other in terms primarily of belief and ideas. And so I think practice and understanding how practices of religion and science can be related to one another is an intriguing way and an alternative way in some ways for thinking about these things as well. Finally, I want to draw your attention to the various ways that religion comes up in the scientific workplace. And I will say, again, you learn from your respondents so much. We had a scientist who said to us, whether or not you like it, it still comes up and you have to deal with it. So we find that especially in nations where there is a large proportion of foreign-born scientists, that immigrants often bring their religious traditions with them when they migrate. And their religious traditions can be different than the dominant religious tradition of the nation in a way that can have a perceived impact on the scientific infrastructure and the actual practice of science. Also, we found that both religious and non-religious scientists say they appeal to religious traditions in matters of science ethics. And in some regional contexts, especially in those contexts like you present on the chart earlier, where the public is more religious than scientists, scientists often need to figure out creative ways to interface with the public, especially if their research involves public funding and support from the public in some way, or actually in some cases involving people in their research, so as some human biology experiments do. So a significant minority of the global scientific workforce is living outside their home nation. Science is a global enterprise, which is one thing that made this study just so incredibly exciting and thrilling to do, and we kind of held on even when it got really, really hard. It was because it was frankly fun to travel all of these different places, to meet all these different people. You meet some of the most interesting and wonderful people you could ever meet in these different global contexts. When people migrate, they bring their religious traditions with them. Hindus and Buddhists enter US science, Muslims enter the UK and French science. In Islam, for example, symbols of faith can be more apparent, especially for women when compared to Christian symbols, for example. A cross can be worn under a shirt and not so visible to display. And under certain conditions, such overt symbols can lead to forms of perceived discrimination. Here's a quote from a physicist in France who said this: I had an interview with a Muslim girl who wants to come here. and to work in their labs. So I did an interview with her through Skype, but then I could see that she was Muslim because she had the veil. We had a lab meeting, and then I said, okay, I interviewed this woman and stuff. She seems okay. And then I brought the issue that she was a Muslim with a veil, and some colleagues didn't want that in the lab. They think it will interfere with the work. There are many ways that religion enters science through ethics. Non-religious scientists certainly discussed ethics with us, and we wouldn't in any way want to communicate that they didn't have ethical reflection. But we did find that one way that religion came up in scientific work is that religious scientists explicitly discussed how their religious tradition shaped the way they thought about ethics in relationship to their scientific work. So things that came up, which I think are particularly interesting, is that faith may motivate scientists. They may perceive that it motivates them to treat their colleagues as people rather than simply in utilitarian roles, or more generally, to be community-oriented. This was a theme often in Italy that came up as related to Catholicism more broadly. Faith can shape ideas about how one feels compelled to share scientific research with communities, and it can shape things like who one decides to take funding from and doesn't sometimes. Religious scientists told us that their faith can, and I think this kind of simply put, shape their sense of right and wrong. Here's a professor of biology in the UK who says that religion provides a check on those occasions where you might be tempted to shortcut because you want to get something published and you think, oh, that experiment wasn't really good enough, but if I portray it this way, that will do. And so this biologist told us it's at that point where he kind of looks himself in the mirror and says, like, you know, I need to stop here, that it's sort of part of my faith tradition that I can't just stop short of doing something in a thorough way. Faith can also shape how scientists interface with the public. When the public brings religiously based challenges to scientific research and ideas such as evolution, human embryonic stem cell research, and there's a lot of excellent work going on in the Baker Institute around that topic. This is especially salient when scientists work in the midst of a public that's a good deal more religious than they are. We see conditions under which scientists, as I said, actually need the public for funding approval, even for doing experiments that involve human subjects. And so it seems that under that kind of condition that religion can enter science. Here is from a UK biologist. He said, I work with food, and sometimes the research work would involve tasting and analyzing samples that may not be compatible with everyone's religion background. So if I knew the number of my participants would prefer halal meat because that's what their religion sort of suggests, we would try to source halal and be clean about it, or we would offer the choice not to participate if they feel that the samples are not compatible with their religious views. I want to end by focusing in a little bit on the US because this is the context that we're coming from, where we're probably is our primary context for thinking about the relationship between science and religion. Here's 3 things that came up that I think might be useful to think about if we have the goal of dialogue between religious communities and scientists in the US. Often we start in these kinds of conversations with trying to address conflicts. And you'll see, as researchers, that was our orientation initially on the survey. We're going to ask you straight up, like, do you think that there's a conflict between science and religion? Yes or no? But I think we've learned through our research that sometimes it's better to start with areas of commonality or common ground to forge bridges between communities where there aren't bridges. One issue that came up among our US scientists is that there were possibilities where scientific knowledge could actually foster faith-based or religious efforts to help us better care for one another through medicine. There was a lot of affirmation in other studies that I've done on the US public about medical care, and scientists in our study mentioned that sometimes talking about the medical advantages or the increase in medical technologies of their work was a way in which they could really convince religious communities of the importance of their work. And to talk about caring for the environment. Our environmental scientists in our study often said, especially those who themselves had some faith orientation, often said that if they explained their environmental work as scientists in almost quasi-theological terms, not so much as environmental science, but as caring for God's creation, that was a way of crossing boundaries through using a kind of language that both honored the scientific work, but also honored the sensibilities of the faith community. Another thing that came up in our study is the relevance of seeing scientists, and I put deliberately in the pews here because I think that's particularly relevant to Christian communities, some of which in the US have had conflicts or concerns about scientific research. To see those scientists who are already in the pews, who are part of faith communities as potential bridge builders. I didn't get to talk about it very much in this study, but we studied a range of scientists in this study, both those who worked at top research universities and those who worked at other kinds of institutions and some who worked outside of the university. And we find in our broader research that in the US, for scientists outside the top universities, that a pretty significant minority of them consider themselves Christians in the type of traditions that are well represented in the US public. And so it could be that the scientists that are part of these types of congregations that have some concerns about science could be the kind of primary builders between scientific and faith communities. Often when we apply for our grants, we don't think of this as a possible outreach activity that we might do in the scientific community, but we might want to orient our thinking in some cases a little bit in that direction. Lastly, often both scientific and religious communities are concerned with issues of inequality. And that's an area that has become very relevant to science, where non-whites, especially Black and Latino Americans in the US, are vastly underrepresented in the scientific community. In our broader research in the Religion and Public Life program, in the churches that we've studied as part of our broader research, those we study often say that it seems like science is a kind of no trespassing zone for African American scientists and Latino scientists, perhaps because both of their faith and because of their racial identities. This is something which concerns the scientific community, I know. And so it could be that those who are part of these traditions, who are already present in the scientific community, could be bridge builders, as I've said, but we could also see conditions under which religious communities, which often are the purveyors of after-school programs for kids, for childcare, could be sites where science training and science enrichment could happen as well. So that these congregations could be seen really as sites of enriching science and advancing science is one possibility that our respondents brought up in this study. So at this point, I think I'm going to stop there, and I want to acknowledge that you have many other things you could be doing tonight, and that we have been very fortunate to have the gift of your time. We hope we've made it worthwhile. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think the next line here is I'm just going to do a few questions that I get to pick, and then we'll open it to the audience.
The survey. You're going to box me in.
So I am going to ask all those questions I wanted to ask all this time. Are you ready? No, just kidding.
Maybe not. Yeah, maybe.
Let me ask questions that I think will be of interest to the audience. So one would be, if you look at the history of these debate about religion and science in theological writings and historical writings among philosophers, it is dominated by the Anglophone traditions, mostly England, the United Kingdom, and America, and less so in other parts of Europe. And from the data we just saw, in places like India, it's not even clear that it even makes sense. So my question for Elaine is, what is it about America and the UK that makes this concern particularly salient? Is it the religion of those places? Is it other history of those places? And what makes that different from India Italy, France, etc.?
I'm a huge believer in our work, and I think we did great research, but we're not historians. So the first thing that I will say as a caveat is I wouldn't want to make assessments about the historical trajectory of those places that led to where we are now. But some of the things that came up often among the scientists themselves in the US and UK in particular is the idea that those are Christian dominant nations, and that really the sort of debate, the ideological debate, if we can call it that, among some forms of science and some forms of religion is really about a kind of intersection between competing truth claims between Christianity and science. So that was very interesting to me to think about. There's plenty of those from the Christian traditions who think that there does not have to be any kind of conflict between a religion and science. But when we talked in particular about the kinds of public issues that were coming up, they tended to be around types of science that have to do with the role that God plays in the world, in the Christian traditions, as well as ideas and scientific technologies around humanness and the uniqueness of humans, where Christian theology takes a certain kind of stance about that. And according to some Christian teachings, it seems that some forms of scientific discovery are conflicting with that. No one is debating the kind of science that leads to refrigeration, or the kind of science that we love our refrigerators. I don't know where I got that example from. It's just what came to mind. We even, for good or bad, love our iPhones. I was actually surprised in other studies that I've done that we don't debate those kinds of technologies more, because they do seem to have implications for moral commitments. But it seems to be those kinds of things, the scientists said, where there were conflicts.
Okay. So another question is, I think everyone in the room has a common sense understanding of religion. In the American context, we have a pretty good sense of what that means. But in your presentation, you talked about spirituality, and that many of the people you spoke to were spiritual. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit more about what that means, what distinguishes it from religion, and then for the final component of this question is, then we'll pick on Richard Dawkins because he gets to be your symbol here. In Richard Dawkins, there's a particular philosophy of science that he's an adherent of. To cut to the chase, would he say that no scientist should be spiritual?
That's a great question. I do feel a little bit badly that I always pick on Dawkins. I know he says such colorful things, and I always want to say, kind of to be morally honest, I think that Richard Dawkins has done great work to advance the public understanding of science, but I do think he says things that are not grounded sociologically when it comes to what religious people think and do. That was a very nice way to put that. That was like dang diplomatic. So if I must compliment myself, what was the question again? Oh, I'm sorry. So what is religion? That's a really hard one. So we did start out in this study. We spent about a year. I'll try to keep it snappy here, and maybe others can ask follow-up questions. We started about a year doing like focus groups and trying to understand how people in each of these different national contexts understand religion and different definitions of religion across the national context. And we found such different sensibilities across these dominant religious traditions that at the end, on our survey, we mostly just asked about that concept religion, because everyone seemed to know what that meant. So actually that had a remarkable kind of consistency across the national context, that everyone knew what it meant to be religious in their particular national context. So it was a question we could ask on a survey, and I put it up here, the question being, how religious are you? That had a remarkable kind of what we would call validity in each of the national contexts. It seemed to mean the same thing. And because we could ask the same question, we were able to achieve comparability. We could ask the same people, at least have the same question across the national context. Then we also looked at things like beliefs and identities and practices as well across the national context, and those varied immensely in terms of the dominant religious traditions. So you have, Sikhism and Hinduism and Islam and Christianity all present here. Spirituality was very much present as a concept in the Western nations, particularly in the US and the UK. And it seemed to be with reference in part to some kind of Christianity. So it's a Christian-informed spirituality. I bet there are some people who disagree with me about that. So I'm trying to stick very close to the data here. And the scientists who talked about it in ways that had sort of Christian-infused language. Spirituality was not really a meaningful concept in Hong Kong and Taiwan. I remember one of our interviewers, when asked about that idea in one of these preliminary interviews that we did in our focus groups, the respondent got up and was looking around the room where the interview was, looking for ghosts so there was the idea connoted spirits in language. So that did not work as a survey question. So we asked about spirituality on the interviews and tried to get people explaining things in their own terms. I don't think Richard Dawkins has a problem with scientists being spiritual. Spiritual scientists are not making any kind of conflictual claims with science. I think actually he's even written this somewhere or did an interview where he said that he has no real problem with people saying they're spiritual. For reasons that I think spiritual scientists would disagree with, Dawkins thinks that there is no problem because these are kind of meaningless ideas that don't have any traction in the world or have any real consequence for how we live our lives. And the scientists that we interviewed and surveyed would say that that's not the case, the spiritual scientists. They think of themselves as different than their so-called their truly secular peers. They think of themselves as more giving towards students. We've even found in studies that they think of themselves as volunteering more when they're spiritual rather than totally secular, meaning without religion or without spirituality.
Okay. So let's imagine I'm reaching in my pocket and I pull out a check from a foundation for a very large amount of money. And I say, now is your chance. There's obviously some country you really wanted to have done and studied. Now, I know that over the years, and it's blended for me, but I know there's countries that it turned out logistically impossible to do for various reasons. But is there a country that you think to yourself, if I could have studied that country or added that country, I really could have gotten leverage on the question, or would have been really sort of finished off my variation in examining the world, recognizing that what you did was crazy enough. But again, if you would have had the ability to do yet another country, what would it have been?
It's like having a second child or something, right?
Yeah.
You kind of have to forget how hard it was the first time.
Right.
So I do think that it would be interesting. I'm not committing here.
Yeah, I know, I recognize that.
Yeah. I do think it would be interesting to look at societies where religion is the dominant societal authority. So it's not just about whether or not there are a lot of religious people, but when we think about a dominant cultural authority where the truth claims of the society are more about religion than about science. I think that would be very interesting. You do run into massively practical issues because those societies probably do not have enough of a scientific I want to be careful here. Even if I think about particular societies, there are societies that are trying to grow their scientific infrastructure. You'd have to have enough scientists to study to do a meaningful study.
Okay. So you've reached a number of conclusions from this study. And I'm not going to say you should go out and do more countries. Let's skip that idea. But what do you think would be the next question if you're going to continue in this field, what's the next question you should ask? Or what would be the next question, scholars should ask? They should read your book and they should say, aha, she's already identified all of this so far. The next burning question is?
I do think that there are two kinds of directions research in this area need to go in. One is almost a deeply practical direction that I alluded to at the end of the talk, that we need to be asking more about how the organizations that we call science and the organizations that we call religion, what are the conditions under which they can work together meaningfully for particular kinds of social goods. And part of that's a philosophic question, but part of that's, I think, a very practical sociological question that you can imagine case study research and other kinds of research, what are the conditions under which that really happen? I think increasing minority access to science, increasing gender representation in science are two issues where we could think about, rather than religious organizations, primarily being framed as a problem for science, what are the conditions under which they could be helpful conduits to bring a more diverse group of people into science, which we know is only good for science and only good for the people that are in science. And then sort of the other extreme of things, which are more abstract issues, I do think religious communities are raising concerns about humanness. So we focused a lot on evolution and religious people's concerns about evolution, which gets at issues of the uniqueness of the human person. Which is, as many religious people, has to do with being made in the image of God. But thinking about new technologies related to artificial intelligence, technologies, of course, that have to do with the human genome, which there are lots of discussion about that as well. So how do scientific technologies and the implications of scientific technologies reshape ideas of humanness, and how are religious communities responding to that? I think is a really interesting area. Of course, you're doing some of that work, but there's lots more that could be done in that area as well.
So let me finish with this total puffball question. So all the data is completely collected, it appears on your desk, you start analyzing it. The US case you knew very well, because your first book in this area was sort of like the pilot run, but limited to the United States. What was the thing that surprised you the most? You look at all these interviews for all these scientists, all these different countries. What's the thing that you thought going in would be the most surprise? I'll tell you the one, my favorite moment in this was when we were thinking about the cross-national context, even these words. There's a Chinese scholar who was on the advisory committee who said, by the way, you should know that there's no word in Chinese for religion. And so that was
a bit of a challenge.
That was a bit of a challenge. But when you got it all back, what was the sort of thing you thought to yourself, oh, that sounds surprised by that?
So David Johnson and I are writing a book about this right now. We just sort of can't stop. But for me, having been raised in faith communities all of my own life, I was very surprised about the varieties of atheist scientists. Just the complexity in atheist identity. And this is just in one professional community, so of course this could be even more varied in broader society. But that was sort of deeply, in some ways personal, but also a very interesting scholarly finding. In another sense, I think I and others in our research team have been surprised at how scientists perceive the role of science in their own, for those who experience deconversion narratives, where they went from being religious to not being religious, that I thought science would play a much more prominent role. But in their own sense of things, many of them do not think science played much of a role. And that also was very surprising, I think, to me and to others on our team.
Okay. Well, I'm sure you're sick of listening to me.
I think our conveners want, that's right, they want you to go to the microphone.
There's a system here that someone knows how, there's a system for these microphones that I will defer to the people who seem to be, I guess that's what we're doing. So I guess I'm going to just assume that what I'm going to do is by starting to point in that direction and say, do you have a question? There you go.
Then will you answer the question? Or
I'll answer it, what the heck.
Okay, great.
Can you hear me? Oh, great. Okay, so I was curious with the data. Congratulations on getting great data. I was curious about the influence of the educational institutions on the scientists. So was there, in the universities, the scientists were involved in their scientific training, was there also a big presence of religion either in the programs they offered for other faculty or students where they're developing theology, or some private universities are, in my opinion, more religious, where they have kind of an active church and everyone is part of the culture of some smaller ones that I've heard of. So I was curious, did you look at that in the data that you've collected just to see if there's an influence as to the attitude of the scientists?
That's an interesting question. So we have not analyzed that extensively. One way that organization and educational background came up quite a bit is in our Hong Kong and our Taiwan cases, where often many of the best primary and secondary schools are religious schools, often started by Christian missionization efforts, both Catholic and Protestant. And so the scientists, especially those in Hong Kong, my colleague Steve Lewis, I think could speak to this even better, said to us that one said something funny, which was like, well, it's sort of think of a Christian mafia here, which is sort of very odd, for us, because this wasn't the way it played out in some of the other national contexts, that because of the educational pipeline to the best universities, many of those even being outside Hong Kong, and of course some excellent universities inside, that those religious schools were something of a pipeline because of the educational infrastructures that came up quite prominently.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm Jimmy Dunn, and I'm 100% atheist because I see no evidence of a God, devils, angels, heaven, or hell. They are all just imaginary. And some people say, well, you cannot prove there's no God. Well, I think it's up to people who think there's a God to show some evidence of that. I could say there's 3 angels dancing on your head. It would not be up to you to prove they're not there. It would be up to me to show that they're there. But I wanted to ask you, did people really think they're going to a heaven or a hell? How can they describe these things? I mean, why would they believe that? What facts do they have? Do they just say I believe it because I have faith? Is that all they have? Do they show any evidence at all? Or did you ask them if they think they're going to heaven and why they believe that?
So just to sort of frame a little bit what we do as sociologists. So it's, we as social scientists obviously have lots and lots of opinions about things, right? Like often when I was interviewing someone, I'd be like, no, I disagree with it. In my mind, I would think that. But that's not really my job as a sociologist. So we're just listening to what people are saying and taking it in and trying to document it. Certainly there were scientists who thought there was a heaven and a hell. They didn't tend to focus on those, and so you're talking specifically in relationship to Christian traditions, I think. They didn't tend to focus on those aspects of theology or Christian teaching so much in the interviews. They tended to focus on how their Christian understandings and faith had an impact on the ethics of their science quite a bit, and in terms of relationships with people, and sometimes to a lesser extent, the kinds of scientific projects they took on.
Some Christians, I think, that seem to think that atheists have no morals. Okay. That's totally false.
Yeah, no, that's not what we found in our research. We're going to go on over here. Yep. Oh, I'm trying to usurp your role. Sorry about that. I got to get myself back together.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. One question I have is on the role of how people perceive their identity as religious, if that's influenced by the nature and inherent within the religion versus the society in which they are. And I was wondering if you saw any discrepancies in immigrants versus the countries where scientists remained, and if they identified as religious or not.
So where they thought their religious identity came from, or sort of the life history of their religious identity?
My question is, if you looked at, like, for example, scientists that remained in India versus Indian immigrants that came to America, if you saw differences in how many identified as religious.
Right, so migration background of the scientist is not something that we really saw come out strongly. So this is what we call cross-sectional data, where we are taking in data at one point in time. We have what I would call quasi-over-time data, in that we do ask questions on our survey and our interviews about previous time in the respondents' lives. And or experience in another country was not something that we really analyzed extensively, but it didn't obviously come out. I would say experience in another country as a scientist did have an impact on scientists in other ways. So many scientists receive training in a nation outside the one that they work in. And when you go to a different nation, you take your religion with you. And that sometimes has an impact on the scientific infrastructure. And likewise, the societal religious concerns and identities have an impact on the scientists themselves as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Great presentation, great study. I'm from India, and growing up, I don't recall ever having a choice between being religious and not being religious. Whether you are Hindu or Muslim, it pretty much was like that, and that comes to the first question that was asked. And then two questions. Was the study restricted to biologists and physicists on purpose? And then if you noticed any difference in the outlook between the data collected from biologists?
Those are both great questions. So I think what you're talking about, firstly, is the idea that religion can feel achieved and it can feel ascribed. So in some cultures and traditions, your religious identity feels like something you were born with, right? And that goes along well. Often then, when people encounter other people from other traditions, then they can move into a more achieved status where they feel like they're choosing aspects or not. Often people in national contexts, like the U.S. Christian context would be one where religion is supposed to be achieved. It can feel very ascribed as well, where you're sort of born into a particular kind of family. So that's something that sociologists of religion talk a lot about. We deliberately chose biologists and physicists, physics as disciplines rather. These are disciplines which are present in all of the national contexts that we were able to study. They're also disciplines which have varying degrees of both basic research and applied research, recognizing that those are imperfect distinctions. They're also disciplines that have different kinds of histories with religion. Which was interesting for this study. They're disciplines that have different portions of women. We know that women in most societies are more religious than men. So there are sort of various reasons that we chose the disciplines.
Okay.
Hi, Dr. Ecklund. Thank you for the presentation. This is just a very practical research question. So I've noticed that there are some bloggers who take issue with your work, with this study in particular, because it was funded by Templeton and Luce, which have certain religious persuasions themselves. And they say that might have influenced the outcome of this study, which I don't believe, but I am curious what it's like as a researcher to work with organizations that may have certain religious persuasions while working on a project about religion.
Yeah, good question. So this is just to clarify, the project was funded by the Templeton Foundation. There's two different Templeton Foundations that funded it, the Templeton World Charity Foundation, and later analysis portion was funded by the Templeton Religion Trust, so it wasn't funded by Luce. I didn't want to put them in there. They do fund in one of our other studies. And the ethics portion of it was funded by the National Science Foundation. The Templeton Foundation, I think, has been pretty outspoken about wanting to do research that can describe the worlds of science and religion, so that's a real focus of that particular foundation. I will say that they have been good to work with in the sense that they have not tried to influence the research findings either way. I think some of the things that we've found, they're frankly a little bit disappointed in, and they've been good about, not saying, no, say this other thing. So that's important. I think your larger question, Michael, is probably more about like what it's like to receive pushback from the research community. Don't do it now. I know you're tempted, but if you Google my name and religion and science as words after my name, you will find some interesting reading. Wait until after the presentation. You have me in the person now. That's kind of stuff just happens. I mean, these are controversial topics. I try not to take it too seriously, if that makes sense, except when sometimes people do have genuine critiques and you can change things in your presentation of material in a way that helps it, be more well received by people. Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks.
Okay.
Hi, really interesting topic. I'm actually a PhD scientist myself. I'm a geologist. And this is related to a previous question. One thing that occurred to me is that you focused on physicists and biologists, but within geology, one fundamental conflict with religion is the question of the age of the Earth. So do you think by excluding that as part of the physical sciences, you're weeding out that particular segment of the scientific society in your data?
That's an interesting question. I really like that question because we thought about that kind of thing quite a bit. And what we were surprised by is that the identity writ large as a scientist means even if you're not, for example, like evolution is another one, right? If even most of the people that we studied were not evolutionary biologists, that's not every type of science, but everyone takes the evolution debates seriously. So everyone, especially in the US, feels like, you know, that's me too, that's being discussed as a scientist, like I want kids to learn evolution in school too, even though I'm a physicist or I'm some other type of biologist. So that was kind of interesting to us. So I do think the public debates came up in scientists' imagination, even if we did not study the type of science where it would seem that the issue would be most present. I don't know where you went. Like then people ask the question and just like nodding. Oh, thank you. Okay. Yes, good job.
Yes.
That's a good question.
Good evening. Yes, I was very interested in your findings on Italy. I myself grew up in Spain and was educated by a very conservative Catholic order.
I'm only smiling because this is like my worst fear, where like everyone from each of these nations stands up and it's like, that's, and I actually am from there.
You know, throughout my education, it never occurred to anybody to see a conflict between science and religion. And the issues that I later found when I came to the United States to graduate school about creationism, people questioning evolution, this was something that just among educated people was not done. Now, the practice of religion is a little different. Now, my son is a physicist in Madrid. My former wife is a professor of applied mathematics, and my former father-in-law was a researcher and engineer. And it wouldn't occur to any of them to take a step into a church, except that my son was baptized. He had a first communion. If he gets married, I'm sure that at least the first time, he'll do it in a church. My father-in-law, when he dies, there'll be a large Catholic funeral, even though, as he used to say, all religions are false, including mine, which is the only one that really counts, which is Roman Catholicism. And I think it's because Italy and Spain and Southern Europe, you know, religion is so involved in the culture now, this might be changing, that it's kind of hard to escape it, and it's hard to criticize it, really. And one factor I wonder if you came across in these countries is a very strong anti-clericalism among the educated classes. People might like the religion but really hate priests with a real passion. My father-in-law, for example. And the most extreme example of this I've read about is André Malraux in his Anti-Memoirs speaks of his grandfather, who was a practicing Catholic but hated priests so much that he would go to the cathedral at Strasbourg and he would actually follow Mass from outside the cathedral. And so he would be in the main square of Strasbourg following all the rites in the middle of the snow and rain and whatever it was, but he would not enter the church because he hated.
So are you asking if scientists are kind of anti-authority?
Well, no. What I'm asking is, in Italy and maybe in France in particular, did you consider the question of anti-clericalism in the sense that a person may be religious and maybe even, quote, a practicing Catholic in the sense that they get baptized and go to First Communion, they want their kid, all that sort of stuff. But really, they hate priests with a real passion. And I wonder if that issue came up. And it's something that, again, I find most Americans find hard to understand. And again, it's because of the historical consequence of what happened in Italy and Spain in the prior. Was that an issue that anybody brought up?
So we didn't really come across people who said that they hated priests, but I do think you raise a deeper kind of question about how the dominance of religious traditions in particular kinds of nations shape the conversation, both obviously the experience of religion, but then also the conversation or lack thereof around religion and science. Yeah. So Italy, obviously a heavily Catholic nation, there were not so many conflicts because everyone was kind of on the same page religiously, right? So you need some kind of distinctions and difference for there to be different opinions about things as well. And even what counts as religious really is different among these nations. I remember one scientist we interviewed in Italy said he was Catholic, but then in the interview said he's not very religious. He had an enormous Bible in his office. And I, like, you know, a big, like one you might see on a lectern, like a big Bible. And I think again, John had asked, like, where were we surprised, right? And I was like, oh, just personally, I would have counted that as a big religious symbol. But that to him may have just been a family thing or something, you know what I mean? Something that he just sort of had in his office because it made him feel a certain way. I mean, I don't really, we tried to interrogate it a bit, but that was something that came out very powerfully in the study, this sort of variations. And in the UK, obviously the presence of, at least in England, of course in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, there are different religious sensibilities, but at least in England, the Anglican Church, it's sort of everywhere. So we're like secular Anglicans. And what does that mean? You know, when you're a secular Anglican, it's like, well, I appreciate the church. One scientist said to us, I appreciate the church, but thankfully it's a kind of impotent church. You know, you don't really have to take it very seriously. And he was contrasting, so this is where migration becomes interesting. He was contrasting it with these Muslim immigrants, right, sort of pejoratively stated, who take their religion so seriously. Yeah, you know, and so anyway, I could go on and on. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, this is your job. I'm so sorry. I was so used to doing this.
Take it away.
You're a delightful speaker. I wish I was in your class.
Oh, bless you.
I'm an engineer. I worked on my PhD, but I had to drop out because I had a big offer, and there was no way I could have made that much being a professor at the university. So I left for New Orleans and as a petroleum engineer. But my question
I could make many jokes, but I'm holding back. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
But my question is straightforward. What is the role of the media in creating this conflict between religion and secularism? I came to America the first year John F. Kennedy was in office. And I have seen the trend in the society and life here in America. And, you know, we used to have thousands of newspapers, radio stations, TV stations. Today, 6 corporations controlling the entire media in the United States. And you almost hear the same thing. And I believe they are the ones who are creating most of this, you know, conflict. And I will have your opinion on that. Yeah.
Yeah, so let me muse, right? Because that's not something that I could really directly assess with the kind of data that we collected. But I do think, and other sociology I think backs me up, that there's a sense when a view is very popular in the press or just public writing that it can seem like the people that there's many more people who hold that view than maybe really do. Does that make sense? So if you write a New York Times best-selling book about the view of your group, it can seem like your group is enormous, except maybe there's just 5 of you writing really popular books about that topic. And so I think that's happened a little bit with this atheist scientist image. And that then can sway popular opinion about trust in the scientific community, if that makes sense, for good or bad.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
I mean, that's my musing on the media without a way to really directly access your question.
Appreciate it. I wish I had a chance to debate Richard Dawkins. I know him quite well. It would have been interesting.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes?
Hi. One thing first. I'm very humbled by your efforts to query the lived experience of scientists around the world, and thank you for sharing that with us. And if I could ask you to speculate, if the antagonism were to be better diffused here, what implications do you think that would have for the kinds of scientific questions that are asked or the nature of scientific achievement? You mentioned humanness. If you could speak more on that, and maybe what other topics you think would maybe rise to the fore or fall to the background.
So I think you're asking a question about the consequences of the current relationship, right? Say between the scientific or the scientific communities, there's not really one science community, and religious communities.
And having had the case studies.
Yeah, so if we think about social issues that many of us want to see advanced, so we may want, as I said, more people to go into science. For some communities want scientists to maybe ethically reflect more on the implications of their research, or maybe bring other types of people who could help them ethically reflect. So if we had better relations between these two communities, and I think there are lots of good signs that there are corners where relations are really going well, that we might think of it in the best world, that these two communities could join together on efforts that might be for our common benefit. So I do think of things like environmental care and issues of justice and inequality and medical access, and there are ways in which we could do work in kind of common ground and common good kinds of efforts.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sure.
So I, from the whole presentation, thought that your research, along with your colleagues, was very admirable. I can't even imagine like the whole process behind it. And so I was just wondering, behind the whole process and research, what was your favorite or most memorable interview that you had along this whole thing?
I thought I asked a good question.
Wow, these are great questions. Are these plants?
Yeah.
They're not. That's really hard to choose. I guess I'm kind of harping on this atheism thing tonight, but one of the first UK interviews that we did was with a UK biologist, and I was asking him all these questions, and he just looks at me kind of flatly, and he says, "You know who you really should be talking to?" He said, "Have you heard of Richard?" And I thought, wow, there are a few, David Johnson and Kirsten Matthews and I and others went on to write an article which we called for a while, "Have You Heard of Richard?" about sort of the UK scientists' public perceptions of Richard Dawkins's work. We wanted to call it "Have You Heard of Richard?" because at first I was like, what, who? So that was kind of memorable. I do think, too, that although I did not have the privilege of doing many of the interviews, some of our interviews in Taiwan and Hong Kong that I've had the privilege of being part of the analysis for have been absolutely fascinating and really I don't mean to other those societies, but have really changed our perception of what's at stake in these kinds of relationships.
Thank you.
Thank you for your patience so far and answering all these questions. And I hope this is an easy one. I don't know if it is, though. But I noticed a comment you made earlier about letting them speak in their own terms, right? Especially varying between their religious backgrounds. You even went and had, you said, hour-long conversations with some of them. Were there any conclusions you drew about maybe a saturation of religious language, maybe even of different kinds, and the effects that might have had on the scientific communities?
So depending on the national context, I do think it's hard for people to, there's certainly many what I would call different secular philosophies for thinking about ethics, but in some of these national contexts, it was hard to talk about ethics and science ethics without using religious language, because the way that scientists have been trained to think ethically has been primarily through the religious tapestry of their own lives. That makes sense. I don't want to communicate that secular people can't be ethical. That's not what I'm saying. You asked about saturation of language, and so that's where we saw religious language come up often. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Talking about the issue of conflict between science and religion, I want to ask, is there any way that the issue of cultural values could be at the forefront of this fight, and how maybe politics, the control of the society, will use science to edge out those other religious values in order to carve a place for the dominant issues that could be the push that science is seeking to put upon the society, have a way of controlling how this conflict has been going on, where that could be leading eventually.
That's a great set of issues. That's something that people have really started to begin to write about. So if we think of politics broadly as power relations, right? Group level power relations, which sometimes coalesce in the polity, right? And in the US and different political parties, et cetera. I do think that science often occupies a powerful place, right, in certain kinds of societies as a kind of cultural authority. So you think about, toothpaste commercials, it's powerful to say, 3 in 10 dentists think, no one ever asks, like, how are these studies really done? I asked that, but and so why is that powerful? Because numbers are powerful, the word study is powerful. So I think this thinking about the kind of power and types of power that science has in particular societies, and then to what end that power is used, I think is a really smart question to be asking. I also think it's important to think through what some scholars and what I call the kind of community of memory that your particular people group or has with science. So of course we think in the US about horrific things that have been done at the hands of science, like the Tuskegee syphilis trials. And so then when in certain communities there's a kind of mistrust of medicine, it doesn't come from nowhere. There are certain kinds of histories that can be present that can then have an impact on what's happening now. And so understanding, John asked questions about history earlier, which is not my area, but certain sociology should be informed by history. We can start to understand where modern day, current day people's ideas come from in a way it starts to make more sense to us.
Yeah. Can I ask one more?
I don't know.
We are supposed to go, so I'm going to ask the person behind you as the last person standing and the last question, then we have to go.
But we can talk after. Yeah.
Okay. My thoughts, and I really enjoyed your presentation. It made my mind sort of put things in my own order. But what's most impressive to me is science and religion have such a totally different measurement system. Science, the measurement system are facts that can be recreated. You can prove the speed of a whatever, the gravity of a whatever, the effect of relationships and things. And it's really tied to provable facts that can be duplicated. Medical treatment, you have duplicate the effect. Religion is tied really to personal experience. And there's several concepts of religion. One, of course, is people who believe that every word in the Bible is correct. I have a cousin who believes that any mistakes that were ever made in the Bible, God corrected in the King James revision. But that's how God speaks to him. And every one of us, God speaks to us a little differently, more as we are. And we interpret that experience in our own culture. To me, that's a huge difference in approach. And it's not that they disagree, but very little in religion can be proved in the sense we expect scientists to prove what they do.
Are you asking how I would respond to that with these data?
Well, how does that fit in what that's how I was, in my system, that's how I interpreted the world.
So one of the things that was surprising to me, so we surveyed 22,000 scientists and interviewed 609 of them, and over the last 15 years, I've personally interviewed about 1,200 scientists. I've been surprised at the varying approaches that scientists themselves have to both science and to religion. So I think that many scientists would not agree with the way that you've categorized science and religion as bodies of knowledge. So, I mean, that's just something that's kind of come out of these data. Some certainly would, but they have, I mean, there would be scientists who would say, it's not that science is completely socially constructed. There aren't scientists usually that think that. But that they do think that around the edges of science, there is a great deal of interpretation. They say the phrase, they're not uninterpreted facts, for example. That doesn't mean that they think there's all kinds of variation in how people do scientific method in a particular field, but they understand the social influence on science, and that science is done by very human and limited people. And I think there are certainly scientists that think that religion is perhaps a different way of knowing. As I presented, there is this sort of Stephen Jay Gould, non-ever-loving magisterium, that there's this sort of equal and different ways of knowing. There are certainly ones who think that religion is not really a valuable way of knowing and really can't be known. And there are ones who have what we call in the study a kind of collaborative way of viewing things, think that there is one unified reality and that science and religion can kind of get at aspects of it. So that's just sort of a description. But
or they agree on the facts, it's the analysis of the facts that they disagree on?
I'm gonna have to talk to you later at greater length. Yeah, this is complex. Thank you so much.
So I'm standing here and delay long enough for Kristen to come up and tell us our final orders here.
Okay, well, I just want to thank Dr. Ecklund and Dr. Evans for participating today, and we have, I believe, a reception out front for you. Dr. Ecklund's available for book signing. I think there's even some books for purchase, which she's already plugged for us. But please, thank you for coming and enjoy.
Thank you so much. Thank you.